I'm joined here today with Lisa Bilyeu, author of Radical Confidence. She's here to have a chat about the newest chapter in the re-release of this book on toxic relationships. We dive into all things toxic relationships, what they look like. Lisa shares her own personal journey of being in, leaving, and healing from a toxic relationship. You're not going to want to miss this conversation. Stay tuned. So thank you again, Lisa, for coming back and having another chat. I know just a bit ago, actually, it was probably longer than I even remember now, when your first book, Radical Confidence, came out. What a gift to the world. I know so many in my community resonated with our conversation. I imagine grabbed your book. I think confidence is one of those areas that many of us struggle with. And so when you reached out and let me know that not only is a new print coming out, though a new chapter has been added, specifically on the topic of toxic relationships, I knew I wanted to get you on, have another conversation, and to dive into all things relational, toxic relationship, of course, the impact that it has on confidence. So thank you for having this chat with me here today.
Oh my God, absolute honor, my homie. I love you. I love what you stand for, what you do for your community. And so honestly, this is truly my honor.
So let's get started. What inspired as you were, offered to write a new chapter, or maybe even thought to write a new chapter? Why is it that toxic relationships, I guess, came to mind? What is the inspiration for this new edition?
Yeah, it really came from assessing what are all the things that we struggle with and what gets in our way. And when I started to think about how, our mindset, the way that we think actually holds us back from our goals, and failure, things like that are all very real that can really dent our confidence. But the thing that I just keep coming back to when I listen to people is that if you're in a relationship that isn't healthy, it can literally erode your confidence to the point where you don't even know who you are anymore. And when I look at all the things that we struggle with, that's the one thing that can really erode your confidence or actually uplift your confidence if you're in a healthy relationship. And so I almost realized that in my book and my story, the big thing that was missing was talking about my toxic boyfriend before I met Tom, because that was the moment where, when I was young, I was insecure and I was in a relationship that made me feel less than. I wasn't able to build my confidence back. And it wasn't until I'd met Tom, who lit a fire under my confidence, who elevated me, that I realized that one decision of being with somebody or not with somebody can dent your confidence potentially for the rest of your life.
I appreciate you sharing that, Lisa, because I think for a lot of us, it is the experience of almost like a retrospective, right? When we have a different relational experience, one that's less toxic, that then gives us that opportunity to kind of look back and to define, I think, more accurately what it was. Because for a lot of us, at least, I mean, some of us might have, very well intentioned friends or loved ones kind of waving from the sidelines, trying to tell us how toxic they view our relationship to be, though when it's us in the relationship, especially if that's the only type of relationship that we have ever known, which for a lot of us, again, begins in childhood, we don't. It's almost as if we have blinders on. And so I appreciate how throughout the book you've talked so honestly and shared so much of your experience. So in particular, you sharing so honestly around this particular relationship, I just know it's going to be so healing because I think these are the moments that we keep close to heart, many of us, because we feel shameful. And I just want to read a quote because I love quotes, as you know, and you write, and I think this was actually maybe verbatim, something that this previous boyfriend had shared with you, and imagining many of my community and listeners might have heard something similar. You write how he had said some version of, "You're never going to find anyone who loves you as much as I do." And then you go on to say kind of your own process. You can see now how you were trapped in a textbook toxic relationship, one that poisoned my understanding of who I was, how I saw myself, what I deserved, and how I saw the world as a whole. So I just want to, kind of dive in there in terms of especially that statement, because I know a lot of us probably heard some version of being told by a toxic partner, right? All of the reasons why we shouldn't or can't leave. So if you can kind of share a little bit about kind of those early moments and of course the shift in understanding that then happened where you were able to see that moment and see him in that relationship a bit more clearly.
Mhm. Yeah, I love actually how you broke it down. And the key with with the blinders, it's like you have these blinders, especially if it's your first love, especially when you're young. The thing that I would add to that is, especially when you're insecure, especially when
Mhm.
you have self-doubt, because that becomes the concoction, if you will, to the bomb that ends up happening. And so here I was, I'd been bullied as a child, I didn't feel good about myself, I was very insecure, I never got a boyfriend. And so along comes this guy who told me he loved me, who sometimes was very sweet, was very kind. And other times he was very mean and very cruel and very verbally abusive. And so it was just enough of the combination to keep me where I was. And every time I thought I had the strength or the ability to recognize that it was a dysfunctional relationship and it was time to get out, he would use verbiage that he knew would trigger me. So if you're someone that never felt loved, that never felt admired, and then they turn around and says, no one's ever going to love you as much as I do, you take that as truth. Because I think one thing that if you have a sweet and kind heart, you think that what someone says is true, because if you were to say it, it is true. And so you take that on as, unfortunately, truth. So when he said that to me, that fear of, oh my God, I don't want to be alone. What if I never find anybody? He does say that he loves me. And at times he does show that he loves me. So maybe better the devil you know. And I then ended up staying there out of fear that I'd be alone forever, that I'd never be loved. And that becomes that toxic cycle where they know exactly how to trigger you because they understand your vulnerabilities. And to your point that you said right at the beginning, that becomes the trap. You don't know any better because you don't have anything to compare it to. All you actually have it to compare to is how you felt when you were by yourself. Now, when I was by myself, I didn't like myself. I thought more highly of myself when I was in a relationship, even though they were toxic, because at least I could say to myself, but Lisa, at least someone loves you.
Right. And I was really struck when you were sharing kind of the relational, what I would call your relational insecurity, and kind of describing you
Mm,
and interacting right with these, group, and, a group of boys in particular who never really saw you right as being kind of quote unquote girlfriend material. And you're
mm,
really speaking to so much of my early childhood. And I remember very similar to you, right, with the soccer shorts on. I just want to like play sports with the boys. And as I started to see other girlfriends I had at that time at the same age, kind of shifting their relationship with boys into more romantic ones, into being desired. And, I didn't look in a way that I thought was attractive. And I didn't like the way I looked in particular. I didn't like the way I was. I felt very shy, very timid. So, of course, like you, and I love the language you use, you quote, I was dying from constantly feeling unwanted. So, right, going with this insecurity, I think it's really natural. We look outside of ourselves for confirmation that we're wanted, that we belong. I mean, for me, in my opinion, this begins in our earliest relationships within our parents, right? And then that just transfers to our peers, right? Do I belong in this peer group? Do I belong with this partner? And so, somewhere down the line, if and when someone shows any version of interest in us, right? Then we get that confirmation that we've been longing for, which I do agree kind of for a lot of us and sends us into this trap. But I appreciate kind of you describing the deep rooted insecurity that a lot of us are carrying in, which then makes it tempting to stay, especially with this inconsistent messaging that many of us get, hot and cold, always then seeking, right? The little breadcrumbing, I think is another language that
mm,
some of us use, kind of whatever it is that you give me that just confirms that you're here and that I'm wanted. And then that will, for a lot of us, as you beautifully describe, keep us, right, locked in these cycles. So, how then, if we kind of want to talk about insecurity within the relationship, now these toxic dynamics, what is it that began to happen like in the course of your dynamic? I know you described a kind of a statement or a concept of making yourself smaller and smaller. So can you kind of talk to us before, of course, you came to the realization and empowered yourself to shift and change the dynamic? What was the trajectory like once you were within it, feeling insecure, trying to kind of accommodate this other person?
Yeah, I think that there's two big things here that I had to look at and own that these were the things that I tied my self-esteem to. It was my identity and then my validation that came from my identity. And before I had met this guy, I felt my identity was a loser who no one loved, no one admired, no good. I was put in a special class for being mildly dyslexic. And so I just, all along the way, the messaging that I got was that, well, that I wasn't great at anything. And so the identity when I met someone is, oh my God, I'm lovable. So that identity I had adopted, and then within that identity, I was seeking the validation that I was lovable. So every act that he would do that confirmed my validation, I'd be like, oh, see, he does love me. See, I feel good about myself. I am lovable. And that cycle is the thing that I was searching for because I was insecure. And so anytime he would do something that was quote unquote bad, verbally abusive, or anything, I took that on as okay, in order for me to be validated, I shouldn't do it. So let me just mold myself slowly into the thing that he needs so that I can feel the validation in my identity that I'm lovable. And that came from myself, it came from my own insecurities, and that was the trap itself. Obviously, we can talk about how I then got out of it, but I think I had to look at what's my identity wrapped around this relationship, and then where am I seeking validation? In my book, I call validation like validation is for parking because we look for validation elsewhere, and it becomes the velvet handcuffs because in that moment, the validation actually feels good. And that's part of the trick, right? The handcuffs may be gold, they may be cushioned, they may feel
Mhm.
soft, but they're still freaking handcuffs. And so that's kind of how I felt with the validation piece that in the moment, it feels really good. But the truth is, it's just there to keep me trapped.
I love how you're bringing up identity, because you even go to speak of, and I think this is going to speak to a lot of listeners, how in a lot of these relationships we lose, or maybe we've never known who we are, right? So then this perfect storm occurs, right? Where if I'm only defining who I am, my lovableness or my worthiness, right, whatever it is, based on someone else, then it's really a natural question to follow, and then even concern and fear, I could say, to consider, well, then who might I be without this
Mhm.
defining identity? And I think, again, when we put so much on another to receive validation to define who we are, it's really natural. So I just wanted to kind of speak to the listeners, because I know, especially as we get up in age, if you will, to question and to wonder who we are. For a lot of us, the fear of not knowing, the shame of not knowing, the wondering of what it will be like to not have that validation is more than enough to keep me in these toxic patterns, because the fear is too great. And you
Mhm.
go into, and I said one of the kind of concepts of breadcrumbing earlier, but you kind of cover within these relationships some dynamics. You talk about manipulation and gaslighting and ghosting and codependency and love bombing and breadcrumbing. So if you can give us kind of any, for any listener who again might have these blinders on, right, might not might be getting all of their validation, right, not even being able to consider who they were, might not even have this sort of language for these dysfunctional or toxic dynamics that are impacting confidence. Can you kind of give us a little bit of kind of what that could look like, so that maybe some of us can see in our own dynamic that that is actually what is happening?
Yeah, so I'm going to steal from an incredible woman called Dr. Nicola Pera. And she's the person that taught me to start listening to the body, to start listening to your insides. What is that telling you? Because the second you notice the discomfort is the moment that it's telling you something's wrong. And what I did is I just tried to ignore my discomfort. I ignored what my body was screaming to me. I ignored all the red flags because I was so seeking to feel validated. And that one moment, that like hit of dopamine where I just feel good about myself, that I just would keep ignoring all the signs. And so I think that very first thing that we,
Mhm.
should identify is, does it feel uncomfortable? If it does, you need to start to go down that path and ask yourself why. And I never did that. I was trying to convince myself or tell myself that my body doesn't know. The thing that the TVs, the movies, right? Society tells you is you find a guy that is going to love you, that is, and that's the end of the story. And the truth is, you need to take those blinders off that you said earlier. So once you take those blinders off, you have to embrace it's not going to be easy. It's going to be really freaking difficult. But what life do you want? Actually ask yourself, do you want a relationship that fills you up or sucks you dry? It becomes that simple when you step back. Now, how you do it obviously is very complicated, but that becomes the decision that I never wanted to ask myself. And once I actually had the answer that I want to live a life of abundance, someone that freaking lifts me up, it became clear the person I was with doesn't do that. And so I think understanding that, and then also writing your values, writing what you care about, write out your morals. Who are you fundamentally? And then the person that's with you, do they match your values and your morals? Instead of you shaping yourself to them, how can you make sure that you stand firm in what you care about? And then that will give you almost like a guiding post of, okay, this is who I am. This is what I care about. This is what I value. These are my morals. Does a person with me match those? If the answer is no, now you can start to kind of go deep and listen to yourself and think, okay, is this relationship right for me?
I think it's so beautiful is this message of empowerment, right? Which is that we do have this inner knowing. Whether or not we're paying attention to it, of course, that's another
Mm,
conversation entirely, though. There are instincts, right? There is feelings that are happening. And so the goal being, of course, for anyone listening, to begin to pay attention to what those are, right? Because there's value there that's important. And there's so much, I think a lot of us overstep, especially when there's insecurity, when we're just seeking to be loved and we'll take anything and anyone. I think a lot of us, when relationships are beginning, meaning when we're meeting someone, getting to know them, we overstep, we delete even the very important
mm,
foundational piece of relationship development, which is having these conversations, whether it's with ourselves in terms of exploring what my values are. What do I want in a relationship, as simply as that is? What do I value? Right? What are my morals? What is important for me in my future? And what I mean when I say we delete that is those of us that are insecure, just seeking to be picked, if you will, that doesn't matter because all that matters, right? Because we need that validation
mm,
is the fact that they want to see more of us, whether or not we want to see or build even a future, right, with this person. So for a
mm,
lot of us, and I imagine listeners might even be well into relationships, it's not too late to have these kind of points of pause and to take the time and to curiously then explore these deeper questions about ourselves in terms of values and what we want. And then being able to then ask the question in terms of how does this align with the person in front of me, whether I'm just getting to know them and I can maybe explore and directly ask these questions because they're important, or whether I know them already and I can explore, a new context of the relationship by bringing maybe up this topic that has been avoided. And so I think that's such an important, just practical component of a relationship that I think a lot of us, we are so focused on what someone else thinks that we don't take these moments to understand that we are part of the relationship, kind of creation in and of itself. And I want to go into too, because you talk about, and I think it's really
Can I just
important.
add one thing? Sorry if you don't
Yes,
mind. Can I just add one thing to what you just
please.
said? Which I freaking love because this is the problem. It slowly happens over time. It's never just you meet someone, they're verbally abusive, and now you're in it. It's like the analogy that really hit me is the water that drops on the rock over time. And water is soft. Water can be like, it can replenish you. Water can be wonderful. But if it's just consistently dripping, what happens to that rock? It changes its shape. Now think about that as a human. If someone's dripping on you over time, it's not loud, it's not abrupt, it's not abusive, it's just slowly, slowly. Before you know it, that's where people turn around and go, I don't know who I am anymore. You didn't blink, it just happened slowly over time. And that becomes the trap in and of itself.
Yes, absolutely. I appreciate you acknowledging because it isn't for a lot of us just so evident, right? So clear from the beginning. It is this kind of gradual morphing where many of us end up morphing away from ourself entirely. And you discuss, I think it's really unique and interesting and empowering how you bring up the concept. And I'm sure, listeners have heard of red flags, right? So
Mhm.
what to look for in terms of a red flag in someone else. But you very interestingly, in my opinion, Lisa, add another component of it, which is kind of what are red flags even within our own behavior within these toxic relationships that we can identify. So can you say a little bit about kind of red flag and these kind of two different versions? Because again, I think it's instinctually we always think of, oh, well, what is the red flag in what someone else is doing? But there's so much, I think, value in even looking at possible red flags in what we're doing in the context of these relationships.
Yeah, thank you. But so I'm all about growth. And so I set a goal and I just say, how do I actually get to my goal? And what's in the way of me getting there? And the truth is, when you're looking for a really healthy, beautiful relationship to last, hopefully forever, you have to look at what's your part in it. Because if we all believe that a relationship is two ways, if we believe that a relationship should be 50 and 50, 50%, 50 and 50, just looking at the other person actually doesn't help me to get to my goal. And that's the truth. I don't want to look at everything that I've done wrong. I don't want to acknowledge the things that I've done wrong because they suck. But the truth is, I can't get better. I can't improve. I can't get to that perfect relationship that I'm seeking if I don't actually look at my own participation in what went wrong in the relationship. And so you can never, ever, if we could, Nicole, I would do it, but you can't control other people. You can't force them to do what you want them to do. And so I just go, I can't force him. I can't force my ex to behave in a certain way. I can't force my husband to behave in a certain way. But you better believe what I can do is take ownership, not blame, ownership over how I showed up in that relationship. That's how I'm going to get to my goal because then I can improve, I can evolve, I can change. And so, to your point, is that my ex had a lot of red flags. And instead of leaving, which at that moment I had the choice, actually, I want to make sure, can I just caveat? I'm not talking about physical abuse. When it comes to danger of physical abuse, it isn't as easy just to leave. So I want to make sure that I'm very clear there. But when it comes to verbal abuse in the relationship that I was in, I could have left. I could have left. When I saw the red flags, when he was calling me names, when he was pinching my thigh and calling me fat, like I could have left, but I didn't. What I chose to do was be toxic back. Now, it became a defensive mechanism. It's not like I wanted to be toxic. It's not like it was a conscious thing. But when I look back in hindsight, I just go, why didn't I leave? Oh, because I use this mechanism as a way to maintain the status quo of our relationship. I didn't want to break. I didn't want to fall apart. So the only way not to break and fall apart is give as good as I got. And that's the truth. So now I go, I never want to be that person again. That wasn't a good look. That didn't make me feel good. That isn't the human I want to be. So how do I make sure I never get there again? Well, let me put up my own flags. Let me identify where along the timeline I started to become toxic back and make sure that I don't do that again. And so it really was when someone's abusive, when someone's demeaning you, I now will walk away. Or the words I will say is, please do not disrespect me. Like I've come up with a game plan so that if someone does, I'm not toxic back, that I've got a mechanism and a toolkit, if you will, that I can use so that I don't slip back into old habits. And so that's kind of my game plan is what am I going to say back? Do I walk away? Do I forgive them? Do I accept it? Right. And I got this game plan so I never, ever get trapped again in becoming a toxic person that I absolutely um I don't respect myself when I'm like that. And, going back to the validation thing, the thing that I validate myself on is doing the hard thing, always respecting myself, even when it's not easy.
I appreciate you so honestly speaking to that because I can, even just speaking from my own past relationship experience, the many moments where I met similar even toxicity. I had a very similar
Mhm.
sounding relationship with a past partner who was very verbally and emotionally abusive, even in front of other people, would call me a dumbass amongst many other things. And, in moments, especially when I felt, threatened, destabilized by this, very understandable reaction to very, dysfunctional, toxic, even abusive behavior, instead of, right, taking a grounded approach or the, empowered approach to identify what it was and to create the boundary I needed and leave. I just went head to head. And this is, I think, what a
Mhm.
lot of us then find ourselves in cycles with within our relationship, because you write it so beautifully when you're saying dating someone makes you toxic. And you since learned that your behavior, which haunted me for a long time because I felt so ashamed, also sinking that low. This is an incredibly important part here, was actually a natural response to feeling powerless in a relationship. Right. When we are
Mm.
destabilized, when we're feeling threatened, even going back full circle, right? When we feel like this person is our identity, our only sense of belonging and worthiness, of course, then it's natural for many of us then to sink or to find ourselves
Mm.
going right in to whether it's a combative, right, kind of toxic cycle, a disconnected toxic cycle, right, where we're leaving or ghosting the person or whatever it is. It's only natural because we too are feeling threatened, trying to regain a sense of stability and of control. And for a lot of us, it means so. I appreciate your bravery, and I think it's very difficult for many of us to kind of acknowledge those moments and to do so as you beautifully did in a non-shameful way, because it is, whether we're in a moment right now, right, where we're feeling like we aggressively have to defend ourselves by saying and doing hurtful things, it's coming from a very understandable place, a very understandable anger, a very understandable resentment. And for some of us, the only way that we can try to regain some sense of grounded stability or control that we need.
Can I ask you a question? What is actually then happening to our body and brains when that happens? Because it's weird. I used to run away from the shame, right? It's like, don't admit it. It's so shameful. Lock it in a box and never let it see the light of day. But actually, the very true thing is, every time I voice my shame and I give myself grace, I feel so good about myself. So, what is actually happening then? Because I want to encourage people to actually just own the shame, not hide, because it does feel better once you voice it. But in that moment, it doesn't actually feel better, or you don't think it's going to feel better.
Absolutely. I think shame is one of the most core. And for a long time, it's funny, and I appreciate this conversation going here, Lisa, because for decades, you would have not ever heard me acknowledge shame in my life. It's just one of
Mhm.
those feelings. I didn't think I felt shameful. There was naturally things that I was very good at from an early age. I felt very proud of those things. I was very savvy to avoid, right, showing myself in any unsavory light. So in my opinion, I didn't have much to be shameful of, not to realize how, in my case, and I think in a lot of our cases, shame has become so much of who we think we are. Again, based in our earliest experiences, our earliest relationships, where we didn't get the validation of just being enough for being who we are, regardless of how it was we were expressing ourselves. And so we kind of develop this kernel of a belief that we're unworthy in some way. And then because we are very attentive, attuned, and savvy creatures, all of us, even in our childhood, we modify ourselves. All right. And we show up in ways that keep that shame at bay. So the reality of it is we don't know how to, in my opinion, the large majority of us be with the large majority of our emotions, let alone shame. And why would we expose our flaw, our imperfection? Why would we expose to someone else that which makes us unworthy? Because somewhere along the line, many of us have learned that those shameful aspects of ourselves do damage our connections, do result in us getting shamed or yelled at, or maybe even abused actively, or maybe disconnected from, as was the case for me. So then, right, in this protective stance, hiding our shame, not wanting to tell anyone, even you talk about a red flag being, and this is, I think, another interesting way shame appears, where we hide shameful things. Right now, it's maybe not even about us. Now we're not telling our loved ones or our best friends or our support system about the truth of what's happening in our relationship. It might not even be what we're doing, right? We don't want to share, even just using your partner, right? Or my partner, the verbal abuse that's happening, because then we're afraid if we speak this, trying to find support, that it will only expose our unworthiness. Because why? It must mean something about us that someone is treating us this way. It must mean something about us that I can't leave. So then why would I tell? And so I really appreciate how you kind of offer one of those habits too that I think for a lot of us has become so ingrained where again, a lot of times gradually, we limit what we tell to other people because we feel so deeply shameful about what it means. And then
Mm.
before we know it, right, those blinders are even bigger or even, more comprehensively encapsulating the entirety of our experience. And then at the same time, we're cutting ourselves off from a different perspective, from support. And some of us are becoming then more and more isolated, right, in these toxic cycles, only continuing to validate our own shame.
Hmm. And now add the thing that we were talking about
Mm.
earlier about identity, because if you identify as, let's say, a strong woman or a confident woman, and you've got all these things, the guilt, the shame, anything behind the scenes, you go, well, I can't expose, right, quote unquote, I can't expose this because now I won't be seen as a confident woman. I won't be seen as fill in the blank. And so again, that identity can actually hold us back from speaking the shame, and then the shame actually then holds us back from making any change at all.
Yes. And so the cycle goes. And then sometimes, even as you
Mhm.
talk about trust, right, bleeds into other relationships, right? Because we begin to doubt trusting in general, right? Why trust at all? And I love how beautifully you even talk about trust, right? Trust isn't necessarily a good or bad thing. I mean, I can make a case that trust is a necessary thing, right, in a relationship,
Mhm.
though the question is, right, who are we giving our trust to? But then all of this bleeds together, right? Continuing to contribute to our insecurity and our belief that we can't maybe trust anyone. So we stay with the one person or we stay alone or whatever it is. And then this whole kind of cycle. So, with all of this said, can you talk to us a little bit about how it was for you to, or what point it was, if it was a point or again, another kind of gradual realization, what allowed you ultimately to leave the relationship or kind of what was that process of coming to this awareness that leaving would be then the choice that would be ultimately best for you?
Yeah, I think a big key was when I met him, I was just in high school. And then as we were together, I went to college. And so actually seeing different dynamics, meeting new people, meeting new couples, meeting different people that think in different ways, you start to see how other people live. And you're like, huh, interesting. He says this to me, but look at that couple over there. There's something that's not making sense here. And so you start to identify these things that are like, huh, maybe I should start looking at that. And it's the questioning, right? It becomes the curiosity of what else is out there. And one of the stories that I share in the book that was really hard for me to share, actually, because it's so embarrassing, going back to the shame and the embarrassment of it. Um, I was like, I have to share this story because this is a perfect example of how we get trapped again in the shame and not recognizing that, no, this is not normal. You okay if I share the story?
Yes, please.
So it's in the chapter in the book, but I'm at college and I'm on the phone to my boyfriend. And so he didn't go to college. He was a delivery boy for Domino's Pizza. But to be honest, that was actually just a scapegoat. He was actually a drug dealer. So just to give the context of, I was going to college. I wanted to make movies. I wanted to, win an Academy Award in filmmaking, and his life was very different to mine. I didn't care about the money or anything like that, but those were our different lives. So I would travel home to see him a couple of hours every weekend. So there's one day I'm on the phone to him in my dorm room, and my friend walks in, and she walks in with a guy. And so I'm in, got a dorm room full of 6 other women, so there's always going to be voices. And he starts to go, "Oh, who's that?" In that moment, you just know, uh-oh, that one question that seems on the surface to be very innocent. Immediately, I rush to, he's jealous, he's getting triggered. Oh my God, he's threatened. How do I distinguish this as quickly and humanly, as quickly as possible? And so immediately, I just try to, oh, don't worry, oh, it's just my friend's boyfriend, don't worry, all right, and then change the subject, thinking that I had managed that, right? So going back to, I make myself smaller, I now manage him, which how many of us do that?
Mhm.
So I'm now managing him. And I think at the end of the conversation, okay, great. He's
Ooh.
forgotten about it. Yeah, yeah. Oh, close call. So I go back to my room. I go back to like watching TV or whatever I was doing. And then I hear a knock on my door. And I open it, and this is a few hours later. He's standing there. And in that moment, I've seen all the movies. I've seen, what's his name? Tom Cruise show up and be like, you had me at hello, you're the one. Like, I've seen those dramatic moments. So I open the door thinking this is a moment where he's going to be dramatic. Oh my God, I love you. And he just walks right by me and he starts looking under my bed, looking in the closet, going into my bathroom, going into my dirty underwear like basket to find some proof that I was cheating on him. Now he pulls out a piece of my dirty underwear and he's like, see, this is proof, this is semen. Now it's even hard for me to say this story out loud, but I need to, because those are the moments where instead of going, this guy's lost his nut, he's clearly jealous and very insecure, he's now throwing blame at me, he's now trying to make me shameful of my bodily functions because it wasn't semen. He's trying to make me, like guilty and shameful over that. Instead of actually seeing it for what it was, you know what I did? I thought that was love. I thought he must love me to drive all the way here and care if I was with somebody else. And that idea at the time where I said it was love, over time, as I start to evolve more and more, I'm in college, I'm meeting new people, I start to go, is that normal? Should a guy really react like that if they're jealous? Why were they jealous? What have I done to make them jealous? And it goes back to the curiosity. Once you start being curious, instead of just accepting the behavior, once you get curious about the behavior, those flags start to become very, very clear. And over time, as those flags become clear, I just started to ask myself, is this what I want for the rest of my life? Like, now that you see the flags, there's no right or wrong. No one should dictate the life that you lead. But do you actually, knowing the flags now that you've identified them, do you want this to be your life in 5 years, in 10 years, in 20 years? When you're on your deathbed, is this the person, knowing what they're like, to be holding your hand as you take your last breath? I actually think about that. And the truth was, if I had stayed with him, once I started to be curious and realized, I thought, oh, he's never going to support my dreams. He's never going to accept the fact that I have this drive to go to America. He's always going to try and hold me back. And the jealousy will only escalate, it will never minimize. And so once I was really honest about what that next 5 years looked like, and I asked myself, do you want this, yes or no? Make it freaking binary. And once I made it binary and once I said no, that's when I started to make the adjustments to build my confidence in order for me to leave.
I think that's what you're describing again is when we have exposure, right? Kind of taking these blinders, just get a little widened, right? You're going to college, you see other relationships. And again, we get exposed to different perspectives or experiences in different ways at different timelines. So that's kind of to give it life what we're talking about, right? Now I don't have just what I know, right? I have what I'm seeing, right, in someone else. And for a lot of us, that then helps us kind of look at ourselves and our own circumstances, our own dynamics a little more honestly. And the honesty too that you're kind of describing when you say the jealousy, right, will only get worse. Because I think some of us contort or have this idea that that's not the case. That if only, like you're saying, if only I manage, if only I tend, if only I change in this way, and maybe even directly we're hearing the changes that we have to make for the jealousy to go away. But again, I
Mm.
think that becomes such a problematic, toxic dynamic where there is this belief that if I just stop or am a little more or listen to them in this way, right, we kind of modify whether it's ourselves or our circumstances in an attempt to make the jealousy go away. Though for the large majority of the scenarios, to speak to your very wise point, it doesn't. We just end up contorting and contorting. And there's always something else because in reality, again, when we're talking about jealousy, what we're talking about is what you began with, which is insecurity. And insecurity is in ourselves. So no matter of contorting for most will resolve or absolve the insecurity that's causing the jealous behavior. So I just so appreciate you kind of giving that language because I think that's a really hard reality. And a lot of us are exhausting ourselves endlessly on the belief of otherwise, that if only or that there is something to do that will relieve these jealous actions toxic even.
Yeah, and I contorted myself so much. I mean, even to that moment where I contorted myself to being like, it's okay. Like, no, I'm not cheating on you. Like, what are you, like me trying to almost get him to calm down by apologizing. What was I apologizing for,
Mhm.
Nicole? Like, seriously, what was I apologizing for? But I still found myself doing it. And the truth is, as I started to see, as I love the idea of the blinders widening slowly, slowly, as the blinders are widening slowly, slowly, and I recognize, oh, maybe that wasn't love. Maybe that was insecurity. Maybe that was jealousy. I had to come to terms with it. I had to own it, that I had contorted myself so that I could have the courage to leave. Because going back to that shame piece that we were talking about, if I keep it in the shame box and it never see the light of day, I can never acknowledge it. I can then never say, if this shows up again, I know it for what it is. If you put it in the shame box, you've forgotten about it. You're trying to ignore it. But I wanted to make sure that I would never get there again in any new relationship. And so that was part of why, even though I still feel uncomfortable talking about it, I must. Because I understand that the more comfortable I get with it, the more I can identify if and when it ever happened again.
So can you now kind of extending the timeline a bit forward after courageously, right, making the choice to leave and then ultimately leaving, right, the relationship ending.
Mhm.
Can you say a little bit about kind of the fallout, if you will, or the what I would call, because you mentioned grief and mourning, and I think the reality for a lot of us that even within toxic relationships, it's still a loss, right? A dynamic has changed. A person is no longer present in the way that they once were, even if there is toxic patterning. And then ultimately, too, kind of interested in if and how the fallout again or the impact of this relationship or how this relationship then impacted you moving forward into future relationships. Because again, I think that for a lot of us, right, there is something we then carry in terms of when now present it with the possibility of someone new.
Yeah, absolutely. And the thing that I want to make sure that is so true that I have to keep hammering home, there were beautiful moments in that relationship. And that's why I ended up staying. And so the grief part is, it's easy to say they were a toxic person, they were bad, right? It's easier to do that because now you can like try and let go. It's like, see, I'm done with him. But the truth was, there were beautiful and magic moments. And so, in order for me to be able to move on, I found it important to actually grieve the beautiful side of the relationship and the stuff that was fun, the stuff that was bringing, light and, joy to my life, because I realized it was keeping me stuck. So I had to acknowledge it. I had to grieve that those are moments that I'll never get back with him in order for me to be able to then move on. And, like the death of things, there is that process. And I'm not sure if you actually know the process off your hand, if you don't mind actually laying it out, but I'm so aware that there's a process, right? It's like the sadness, the anger, if you don't mind actually explaining, but go through it. Just say, right now, I'm mourning the death of a part of a relationship that felt great. Do the process, go through that mourning so that you can then start again, build your confidence back up before you then move on to another relationship. But yeah, I'd love to know like that process so that people can really hear it.
I think when we think about grieving and there's a multi-stage process, I don't know the exact though. When I think about grieving, I'm always hesitant too to give kind of like these are the exact emotions because I do
Mm-hmm.
believe grief looks different. Some of us might, right, just feel the loss, the sadness, the loneliness. Some of us, I think, very naturally then move into the anger of all of the unmet needs or all of the violations, right, of boundaries and limits that had happened in that relationship. So I think when I think about any sort of emotional process, grief in particular included, right? I think it's just about learning for a lot of us a new skill of how to be present without judgment to whatever emotion arises. And for a lot of us, it's cycles, right? We feel different ways in different moments. For some of us, certain emotions in terms of our mourning or our grieving period last longer than others. So I'm always hesitant in terms of timelines because my
Mm-hmm.
fear is outsourcing, kind of like what we're talking about here, right? Someone reading a timeline of grief, and if their
Mm.
process isn't going exactly along in terms of what they're feeling or how long they're feeling it, then this is another moment for us to judge that we're not living up to what everyone else is doing, or maybe we're not grieving right or appropriately, and maybe it'll never go away. And so, though grief and what you're, beautifully wisely sharing here and being with it and not just denying the beauty, the reason, the parts of the relationship that we did see value in at one time, the bond that we did create, the life, even for some of us. I mean, grief can look very practical too, not just emotional, right? Lives are that maybe once were embedded or entwined, living together, right? Things now change. And so grieving, and I really appreciate it not only in the book, but now as you're kind of going into that space, because if we don't, whatever our grief timeline is, our process, or whatever feelings are present, if we're not present to them, it doesn't mean that they're not there. Right. And then for a lot
Mm.
of us, I think that continues to contribute to the shame and even maybe what we then carry with us as we look forward into other relationships.
Yeah, God, you're so right about the grief thing. That is 100% right, because we end up judging ourselves that we're not on the same timeline as everyone else. So I love that you pushed back and said that. And as you were actually talking, what I realized was I needed to grieve because I was in this pattern. So he would do something that was very mean, abusive. I would get very sad. I would cry. Then the crying, after I'd cried enough, I then got angry. I can't believe he did this. Right now, it's like the anger. That's almost making me feel powerful, because I went from powerless, the sadness, the brokenness, to then trying to repair myself, gaining the power, but that meant getting angry. So then I would get angry at him. And then over time, that anger would dissipate. And as the anger dissipated, I started to remember the good things, forgot the bad things, and then started to yearn for the happy things again. And that is where then it brought me back into that relationship. So that was my personal cycle that I started to recognize. And so the grief allowed me to let go and embrace that I will no longer have that good stuff, so that when I eventually got there, I wouldn't then repeat the cycle. It was like, instead of going around, a roundabout in England, instead of keep going, it's like, oh, I've actually just seen the exit ramp. And so the grief allows me to exit that cycle of, getting angry, going back to him, fighting, love, love bombing, great sex. I'm going to be honest, right? Great sex,
Yeah,
then back again, the fiery arguments that actually just would make me feel alive.
right.
That's another thing I had to grieve, is that, how do I feel alive again? Oh, that is an unhealthy way to feel alive. Cool. I have to grieve that feeling so that I can actually adopt and cultivate a much healthier way to have a relationship. And that's where the space between you, not jumping into another relationship, making sure that you start to validate yourself, you start to change your identity, you find ways to elevate yourself, and that you find ways to write out your morals, going back to something we'd said earlier, write out your values, and make sure that you've got boundaries, so that when you meet that new person, you've already built a new foundation that that relationship house can be built on.
Ugh, I'm ready to just throw the mic and be done here on that note. In all seriousness, Lisa, I mean, that was just such a beautiful kind of wrap, because the reality of it is we go back to the same person, we carry the same habits with us until we take the moment, right, to reorganize, to reboot, to really look at ourself and get really grounded in terms of making these commitments to
Mhm.
rebuild, for a lot of us, our own trust in ourselves back, our own respect for ourselves, and then our ability to very courageously and vulnerably put ourselves out there again, with the possibility of not knowing what will happen, though, say, keeping committed to the intention to do our part, right, in creating a new, less toxic, more functional, more connective, more authentic dynamic. So thank you, thank you, thank you, as always, for not only gifting us with your book in and of itself, Radical Confidence, but for truly this particular chapter. I think it is
Mhm.
going to be of such great benefit. I know this conversation is going to be of such great benefit for my community. So before we end here, any final words? How and when will this book be out there with this latest chapter? And how can we get our hands on it if we don't already have it?
Yeah, so my final words are actually going to be, this is why I'm obsessed with you in your book. So, how to be the love you seek is the right answer. Like that is the right answer as you go on this journey. If you're looking for true love that is going to lift you up, and going back to something I said earlier, instead of erode you. And so what you stand for, how you encourage people, I really do think it starts with oneself. And so that really becomes the final point of everything we've discussed, is going back internally, is building your validation, everything we've been talking about. So I just want to say, the work that you're doing is transformational, girl. You know that I freaking love you to bits. And I'm just honored to be on here. So thank you so much. If people want to buy Radical Confidence, they can go to radicalconfidence.com and pre-order it. There's a bunch of bonuses on there, where there's a hour coaching exclusive of me and my husband, we've been married for 21 years, and we're 25th. That's the punchline, by the way, of this whole thing, of like all of that toxic relationship. I ended up building my
That was
confidence and found somebody that accepted me for who I am. And so we've been together for 23 years. So we've got an hour exclusive coaching course that goes for free if you pre-order the book now. So you can go over to radicalconfidence.com. And again, I just want to say thank you so much for this. And I really hope, your community is, it brings value to them, because I know how much you fight for them and show up every day for them. So thank you for having me on, homie.
Oh gosh, Lisa, thank you for always your kind words of support. And on a personal note, I will share with you and allow to the community. Your relationship with Tom has always been, before I even personally had the gift of knowing you on a more personal level, has always been something that I know I've looked to, I've aspired to. The way the two of you just cheer each other on and support both what you've built together, and now kind of what you're building together, but though kind of, each pursuing your own passions within your togetherness. I have chills saying it. I just wholeheartedly and happy that we're kind of ending on where you're at now. Because like I said, I've been such a long-term admirer of the relationship. So to hear and to now have an intimate look into the road that got you there, if that doesn't give, I know it, will always give me, and voicing that now for the community, to give anyone out there hope that incredible change is possible, and fulfilling, supportive, celebratory, relationships are 100% possible, even if you are listening now, finding yourself in the toxic dynamic. So just sharing that now, of course, having the opportunity to know you both on a more personal level, it is just such a gift. And the way you cheer each other on and really truly hold each other accountable too. I don't want to leave that part out in terms of pretending like it's all just like, oh yeah, you're great, babe, love you. Like really the true work of being in a relationship and holding each other to their highest self. I could not say more that the two of you embody that. So I just wanted to put that on record for anyone listening, in terms of if anyone had a wondering of where's she at now and what does her relationship look like now, at least
Yeah.
from my perspective. So just thank you, thank you, thank you for who you are, for what you continue to put out in the world, for the way that you continue to support me, and now for the gift that you've given my community in this chat. So thank you.